This mass shooting in Connecticut was really a tipping point in the country, and we want to have a real discussion about it. No talking points, no nonsense. Stick around for this special episode of The Point. Welcome back to The Point. I'm your host, Anna Kasparian, and I'm sure you guys have heard many different news stories reported on the Connecticut shooting, a lot of very shallow, superficial discussions about gun control, but here on The Point, we want to delve into those topics with a little more detail, and that's exactly what we will do on today's show. In the first segment, we will talk about whether or not we're actually going to go forward with real gun control in this country. In the second segment, we're going to discuss the Second Amendment and what it really means, and then finally, we're going to talk about the media, do a little analysis, and figure out whether or not the media is handling this story correctly. But before we do so, let's go ahead and meet our panelists. Our first panelist today is Laurie Saffian. She is the board president of Women Against Gun Violence, an LA-based organization that works to educate the public, policymakers, and the media about the human, financial, and public health consequences of gun violence. Laurie, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Adam Winkler is a constitutional law professor at the UCLA School of Law. He is also the author of Gunfight, The Battle Over the Right to Bear Arms in America, and a frequent contributor on issues of constitutional law to the Huffington Post and the Daily Beast. Adam, I hear you have a very busy day today.
Unfortunately.
Unfortunately. Steve-O is the Chief Operating Officer of the Young Turks, as well as the executive producer of this show and the audio guy for the online version of the Young Turks. I'm just kidding about that. In a former life, he was also an attorney and prosecutor in the LA County District Attorney's Office, where he was responsible for trying numerous cases involving gun-related crimes. Steve, thank you so much for not only executive producing, but also being a panelist on today's program.
It's my pleasure and honor. Thank you.
All right, so let's get right to our very first point. And this point actually comes from a speech that President Barack Obama gave 2 days after the Sandy Hook elementary shooting. Let's take a look.
Can we honestly say that we're doing enough to keep our children, all of them, safe from harm? I've been reflecting on this the last few days, and if we're honest with ourselves, the answer is no. We're not doing enough, and we will have to change. Since I've been president, this is the fourth time we have come together to comfort a grieving community torn apart by mass shooting. We can't tolerate this anymore. These tragedies must end, and to end them, we must change. No single law, no set of laws can eliminate evil from the world or prevent every senseless act of violence in our society. But that can't be an excuse for inaction. In the coming weeks, I'll use whatever power this office holds to engage my fellow citizens, from law enforcement to mental health professionals to parents and educators, in an effort aimed at preventing more tragedies like this. Are we really prepared to say that we're powerless in the face of such carnage? That the politics are too hard?
Now, there was a lot of, strong wording in that speech, and 2 days after that speech, he gave another speech where Obama was a little more specific about what he would like to see in terms of gun control, and he focused on assault weapons. Now, Laurie, I want to start with you on this. Do you think that this is really the tipping point in this country?
Absolutely. I mean, we're seeing that all over the place. People are motivated to action. People are the We the People petition in support of stronger gun laws. It has unprecedented numbers of signatures. I think no petition has ever come close to that. So people are outraged and they want to see some action. And we know that Senator Feinstein is going to introduce the reinstatement of the assault weapons ban immediately, and that Frank Lautenberg's going to introduce the banning of high capacity ammunition magazines. So there's going to be action, and the public's standing by ready to move forward on this, and they're going to demand action.
Now, Adam, the NRA just recently released a statement saying that they are prepared to offer meaningful contributions to help make sure this never happens again. What are your thoughts on the NRA's statement? Obviously, they weren't being specific, but in the past, they've been known to refuse to bend on this topic at all. Do you think that the NRA is actually willing to support an assault weapons ban?
I don't think there's any chance that that's going to happen. I think the NRA is not about to change its stripes now. They are a no compromises opponent of gun control, and that's not going to change. The kind of meaningful action that the NRA is going to start talking about is improving our mental health system, improving security in schools. They're not going to talk about gun control, but I think that they're going to face a real uphill battle, unlike the usual for the NRA. I think we are in a different political environment. We've already seen evidence of that with pro-gun NRA A-rated senators like Mark Warner coming out and saying it's a game changer. We need to start thinking about gun control. Shouldn't also ignore the fact that the NRA had a terrible November where most of their candidates that they endorsed lost. And I think people in Washington are starting to rethink, do we really need to be quite so fearful of the NRA?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the polls, you realize that most people are actually in favor of some form of gun control. I mean, we have a history of mass shootings in this country, and something needs to be done. And Steve, come on, realistically, the assault weapons ban, do you see that as something that's going to happen in this country? I mean, Laurie says that it's the tipping point. Is it really the tipping point?
You know what? I find it amazing that because, 6-year-olds were killed this time, that there seems to be more of a visceral reaction. When Columbine happened, when was that? That was, 12 years ago? 13 years ago? A bunch of high schoolers were killed, a whole bunch of them. I guess high schoolers just aren't cute enough, and we don't care enough about them. And then when there was a Virginia Tech shooting and 32 people were killed there, well, they're college students. Again, just not that cute. Well, now cute little 6-year-olds are dying. Mm-hmm. But what we fail to really talk about more in the media, and I guess we'll get to this in the third segment, is that we have little cute kids dying every single day.
9.
Yes. 9.
34 people a day
Yes.
are killed by guns, and 9 children a day die every day in gun-related incidents.
So I'm really glad that there seems to be a tipping point. I'm a little bit perplexed as to why this, I get it at one level, they're cute little kids. On the other level, how many shootings must we have? That was the third one that week. Mm-hmm. That week, right?
Yeah.
We had the mall shooting a couple of days before.
I actually want to give you and the audience some exact numbers because I found it fascinating once I saw it in front of me, all of the mass shootings that we've had in this country. Of course, there was the Connecticut shooting, 28 killed, 20 children. There was a mall shooting in Oregon, 2 killed. That was 3 days before the Connecticut shooting. A Sikh temple in Wisconsin, 131 days before the Connecticut shooting, 6 killed. Movie theater in Aurora, Colorado, 12 killed. It just goes on and on. Gabby Giffords, that shooting, it was 706 days prior to the Connecticut shooting, 6 killed. The Virginia Tech shooting, 56 killed. Columbine shooting, 13 killed. It goes on, and we're supposed to learn from history, right? But in this case, we aren't learning anything.
And what happened after? So the shooting occurred on Friday. Over the weekend, we had more shootings. And there was a surge in gun sales, an absolute crazy wave of gun buying. So I was reading this article, and it said that the Colorado Bureau of Investigation said that they set a new record for a single-day background check submittals last weekend. In San Diego, Northwest Armory gun store owner said that was the best sales day they had in 20 years. Mm-hmm. And in Cincinnati, there was a gun show that had a line 400 people long from dawn until dusk with people buying guns.
And those are the gun sales that are being reported.
Yes.
40% of gun sales occur on the secondary market where there are no background checks. They're from private sellers. That's just that. And we know what happens every time we talk about introducing a new piece of legislation. Even in California, we have something we were just going after where the gun manufacturers are trying to get assault weapons back into California, and they are doing it. Mm-hmm. And the minute they heard we were introducing that legislation, everyone went crazy, and they were flying out of the stores.
So let's talk about the black market a little bit, because anytime we try to pass any sensible gun control in this country, oftentimes what happens is you'll get the gun advocates saying, well, there's a black market and they'll purchase the guns there, and then all of a sudden the bad guys will be armed, the good guys will not be armed. What is your response to that question or to that statement?
Well, it doesn't make any sense. First of all, more guns means more crime, and we just have to to recognize that, and that the states with the highest rates of gun ownership have the highest rates of gun homicide. I haven't seen people having any trouble getting guns, and these are sensible, reasonable pieces of legislation. We're not trying to dismantle the Second Amendment or take anyone's right to own a gun legally. We're asking for background checks and things like that aren't going to hurt anybody that is legally allowed to have a gun. We don't want guns falling into the hands of the mentally ill and people who shouldn't have them, and laws can protect against that.
Does it go too far, and I know that this isn't going to happen in this country, but does it go too far to say that maybe we should ban all guns in this country?
It's not a reasonable. It's a pipe dream, and it's not going to happen. So we really need to look at what's in front of us, and we do have a right. People have a right to bear arms. That's what the Supreme Court told us. So let's look at the legislation that's going to make a real difference, and we've seen it in states where those kinds of pieces of legislation are in place. It makes a difference. So let's get those on the books nationally and have it happen on a state-by-state basis as well.
It's sort of like healthcare, where you need the baby steps. You know,
that's what I call them, and it's absurd that we're even talking about it. It's a bizarro universe we live in where these are radical changes. Killing machines of mass destruction and war shouldn't be allowed in our streets. I mean, that's just basic common sense and safety.
And the NRA has really promoted this idea for the last 20 or 30 years that we have to oppose any new gun control law lest we end up on a slippery slope towards total civilian disarmament. And it's just absurd. We are not on the slope towards total civilian disarmament. We have 300 million guns in America today, almost one per person. They're not going anywhere, and I think that any effort to get rid of them would have the same fate that prohibition of alcohol had or the war on drugs has had. It would create more of a black market. But we can't let the fact that there will be criminals who still get their hands on guns, no matter what laws we pass, stop us from passing laws to make it harder for them to get guns and to do something to reduce the daily toll of gun violence in America.
Yeah, so there are a couple of arguments against gun control, and one is that you know what, if you have these restrictions on access to guns, well, the bad guys, they don't follow the law anyway, so they'll just get guns anyway, and only the good guys will not have access to guns. Let's say that's actually true and that actually happens. I'm okay with that because people who have guns, those guns are more likely to be used against you or against a loved one than against some bad guy who's intruding into your house. The bad guys who get the guns, they use it on each other. That's a separate issue, and we should try to resolve that as well. But mainly, so let's look at Adam Lanza and his mother. Those were her guns. She was a law-abiding citizen, and what happened? She had 12 guns. The argument that more guns you have, the safer you are, didn't work there. She got shot in the face repeatedly, and she's dead. And her son took those same guns and killed 20 other children. So this idea that more guns equal more safety is just ludicrous on its face, and it's been proven to be false every single time. And if we reduce the number of guns, we reduce the number of gun deaths. It's so obvious and so painfully obvious. If you reduce cars, you have less car accidents. If you reduce elevators, you have less elevator accidents. It's the most obvious thing. Of course you have less gun violence with less guns.
Well, it's really interesting because we have other countries that we can learn from, and one country is Japan, another one is Australia. Australia passed pretty strict gun control just a few decades ago. But if you look at Japan, which I also love to note or reference as an example, I mean, Japan has very few gun-related homicides. In fact, to give you guys some specific numbers, in 2008, when it came to gun-related homicides, the U.S. had about 9,484, that's according to FBI reports. Japan had 11. In 2007, there were 10,086 gun-related homicides in the U.S., 22 in Japan, and by the way, that was a national tragedy there. It was something that they were constantly talking about. How can we stop this from happening again? 2006 was very interesting because in the U.S. we had 10,225 gun-related homicides, but in Japan they had 2. And now in Japan, they haven't just banned assault weapons. They've banned handguns, and if you want to get an air rifle, you have to go through a number of regulations and restrictions regulations and background checks. You got to attend classes, pass tests. What is it with the U.S. where we want to make it accessible to everyone, even if they have a mental illness? I mean, Jared Loughner had a mental illness and he legally purchased a gun. So where does it come from? Is it paranoia? Is it really people that are obsessed with the Constitution, or is it brainwashing by the NRA?
I mean, there's a $200 million communications budget that the NRA has. So those messages, they're persuading people out there, you're safer with a gun. There's a big push, a fear push. You need a gun in your home. You know, it's a holiday gift. Husbands are buying them for their wives. The flashbang bra holster is a big seller out there for women. Get your, to get it quickly.
There's a huge push by the NRA and the gun manufacturers to market guns to women. And the whole message is, hey, you need this to protect yourself against the rapists and the murderers because, if you had a gun, you'd be much safer. But I just want to go back to the issue of gun control itself. One of the other arguments is that, well, if you control guns, what do you do next? Control knives, control cars? And that argument drives me crazy because the answer is yes, we will. If there are 10,000 deaths a year with knives and forks, we'll regulate knives and forks. That's what we're going to do. And we do regulate cars. We regulate them massively because cars do kill people. We have very strict safety standards for, you gotta have a seatbelt in a car, you gotta have an airbag, the brakes have to work so you stop within a certain range, you have to have a certain amount of impact resistance for the exterior of the car. I mean, we have an army of police officers patrolling our streets to make sure that we're driving safely. We have to be licensed. I mean, we have so many regulations for a vehicle that is really a tool in modern society, not designed to murder and kill. And yet we can have no rules at all for guns? That is crazy talk.
I mean, think about what we have banned in this country, right? Illegal narcotics. I mean, when you really think about it, drugs are, when someone's doing a drug, it's a victimless crime. If you decide that you want to take the freedom to inject heroin, I wouldn't do it, but I don't think that anyone else other than the person injecting the heroin is being harmed in that case. But when it comes to guns, guns are used to harm other people in many instances, as I outlined earlier in this segment. So why is it that we have a group of people that don't want to regulate them at all? It's kind of incredible.
Well, we have to remember, too, that there's a lot of people who feel they need a gun for self-defense. I feel pretty fortunate. I live in a community where we have low crime rates and whatnot, but there's a lot of people out there, whether it's paranoia or whether it's just their sense of danger, that they feel that they need a firearm to protect themselves against someone who's going to hurt them. And we should remember that there are 300 million guns in America, and the vast majority of 99.9% are never used in any kind of criminal act. So I think there is a place for people to have a right to bear arms. There is a place for people to have a gun for self-defense without it imposing a serious burden on our ability to regulate guns in the name of public safety.
And it's the reality. I mean, people have guns, they're going to keep having guns, so we need to do what we can to keep communities safe and keep those guns out of the hands of people who shouldn't have them. So a big part of the work we do is talking to gun owners who are supporters of our organization, because we're talking about reasonable stuff. You have a gun, keep it locked.
Yep.
Keep it stored someplace, keep the ammunition separate. 9 kids a day are getting a hold of guns and playing with them and killing each other.
Let's talk about that. I know we're running out of time in this segment, but just one last question, because what you said right there totally defeats the purpose of having a gun in your house for self-defense. Someone busts into your house in the middle of the night, and look, I thought about getting a gun myself, okay? When I moved out on my own, I was like, you know what? I need some form of protection. But it only took me a few days to really think about it and realize, well, I'm not gonna have a loaded gun in an easily accessible place, because what if someone's at my home? What if I have nieces or nephews over? What if they get their hands on the gun? So I'm not gonna have it loaded, I'm gonna have it locked, so if someone comes into my house, I'm not gonna have access to the gun. And by the time I do, they'll probably use my own gun to kill me. And I can't imagine myself shooting someone else.
That's a very interesting question. There was a town hall here recently where Sheriff Baca, our local sheriff, asked the people in the audience, how many are gun owners? Hands went up all over the place. How many of you have actually fired a gun in a situation, a criminal situation? Not a person. And he said, you cannot comprehend the presence of mind that is required in a situation to be able to retrieve your weapon, make sure that it's loaded, and to actually get the person that you're trying to get. 9 people were shot by the NYPD at the Statue of Liberty shooting. Those are trained law enforcement as they were trying to get the shooter. it's just not, doesn't work out the way that the NRA would want you to
this
think.
idea that regular Americans, regular amateur Americans can just whip out some sort of firearm device and protect his fellow Americans, it's really just, fantasy. I mean, let's take the case of the Aurora, Colorado shooting in a movie theater. What would you do if you were sitting in a theater and you had a gun, and you look over, you heard shots, and you look over, and you see Professor Winkler standing with a gun pointed out? Do you shoot him? Right. Or is he a good guy who's going to shoot the bad guy? I don't know. Do I wait until he turns a gun at me? It's total confusion and mass hysteria. I mean, we don't trust one another with our tax dollars. We don't trust each other on almost any issue.
We don't trust our teachers, our public educators, with educating our kids. But all of a sudden, now we're having a discussion about arming them.
Yeah. Look, that's just a complete lie. They don't really even believe it. They want to sell more firearms. That we have 3 million teachers in this country, so we arm 3 million teachers. That's 3 million more gun sales. This AR-15 that was used by Adam Lanza is the most popular gun in America. There's 200,000 guns, 200,000 AR-15s sold every single year. So they cost roughly $1,000. So multiply 3 million times $1,000. That's $3 billion in extra gun sales.
Gun manufacturers will love it.
But one thing we shouldn't, I don't think we should completely underestimate the effectiveness of a firearm for self-defense. While I agree with you completely, Steve-O, that we don't want shootouts in movie theaters or in kindergarten classrooms, that's not a good public policy. It's hard to get the data, there's a lot of disagreement about it, but defensive uses of firearms range from, the gun side tells us it's about 2 million incidents a year. I don't know if that number is right, but even the pro-gun control people who've looked at it closely say it's about 100,000 incidents a year. So it's 100,000 times a year where someone takes a firearm and uses it for self-defense. Now, I don't know what the exact number is, but we shouldn't discount the fact that a gun can be used for self-defense and is sometimes used effectively.
Well, let's also keep in mind that we have laws like Stand Your Ground, where 75% of those murders are considered justifiable murders, but you don't have another individual defending themselves. We don't know what the reality is. So that also plays a role in the number of self-defense cases. But unfortunately, we're out of time for this particular topic, but we are going to talk about guns in the next segment as well when we discuss the Second Amendment to our Constitution. What does it really mean? Do we really have the right to bear arms? We'll be back. Welcome back to The Point. Our next point is about the Second Amendment to our Constitution. And just as a quick refresher to you guys, I want to read you that amendment that many people refer to when they talk about our right to bear arms. It says, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. So first question goes to Adam, since this is your expertise. Is the Second Amendment an antiquated relic, or is it, is it being misinterpreted? What's going on with the Second Amendment? Do we really have the right to bear arms as individuals?
Well, the Second Amendment's wording is very confusing. It's got all these commas in it. It's almost as if James Madison, the author of the Second Amendment, had just discovered this wonderful new thing, the comma, and wanted to put it in as many times as possible. And it's confounded Americans for generations. However, the Supreme Court held in 2008 that the Second Amendment protects the right of individuals to have guns for personal protection and self-defense. I think that ruling is in line with earlier court rulings going back to the founding era. There's been some dispute in the courts about it, but there's been a pretty consistent trend among Americans going back at least to the 1820s to interpret the Second Amendment to protect an individual right to bear arms over and above service in the militia, like a National Guard or something like that. But one thing I think it's important to recognize is that the Supreme Court made clear, and American history makes clear, that there's still ample room for gun control in the Second Amendment, that this provision does not stop us from keeping criminals and the mentally ill from getting their hands on guns, doesn't stop us from borrowing the most dangerous weapons from being out on the street. We can have a right to bear arms and reasonable and effective gun control laws.
Why is it that when it comes to all of our other freedoms, there are restrictions? I mean, there are restrictions when it comes to our freedom of speech. For instance, you can't walk into a movie theater and yell fire. We put people to death for treason when you go to when you basically share information like Bradley Manning did to or if you leak information or share information to our enemies. I mean, there are restrictions with everything. Why is it with the Second Amendment, all of a sudden, people want to get rid of any type of restriction? What makes the Second Amendment different?
Well, I think that there are those who really feel that any restriction will lead us down this slippery slope and will lead to all guns being confiscated. And frankly, there have been movements over the course of American history to confiscate all the weapons. They've never been very successful because the gun rights people and the gun owners are just much too strong a political constituency for that to ever happen. But I do think it'd be wrong to say that there are no limits on guns in America. Guns are very easy to get. There is no doubt about that. But there are restrictions on who can own guns. There are restrictions on which kinds of guns you can purchase. States have a lot of authority in the field here. In California, where we live, we have much stricter gun control laws than in other places. So it's not like it's a wholly unregulated world. But if we do have a constitutional right, we have to take it seriously. And when we're going to adopt a law, make sure it doesn't go any further than necessary to accomplish its goals.
Well, I have a slightly different take on all of that. So it wasn't until 2008 in the DC versus Heller case that the Supreme Court definitively came out and said that individuals have a right to gun ownership under the Second Amendment as opposed to being part of a militia. But in 39, I'm sure you're well aware, in U.S. versus Miller, they challenged a law, the National Firearms Act, where they banned certain types of guns. And the Supreme Court, in a unanimous ruling, said that that kind of gun control is totally fine because the Second Amendment applies with respect to the militia, and that this kind of gun control has nothing to do with it, doesn't infringe on anyone's rights. And that was a unanimous ruling by the court. And then the court didn't touch it, well, the Supreme Court didn't touch it until 2008. So this is a relatively, the way I would characterize it, is that this is a relatively new reading of the Constitution, and then it was extended in another case to the state courts. But I just want to read very quickly James Madison's original version of the Second Amendment, where he wrote, quote, "The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, a well-armed and well-regulated militia being the best security of a free country, but no person religiously scrupulous of bearing arms shall be compelled to render military service in person." That's the Second Amendment. The Third Amendment is about, soldiers can't stay in your house without your consent. So the Second and Third go together. It was really about these militias back then, and all the arms were stored in these public armories. And that's the reason why there's this connection of the militia. You have to keep in mind that the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments of the Constitution, were written to restrain federal power against the states. What they wanted to do was, they didn't want the federal government to prevent state governments from having militias. And in order for the militias to be well armed, they needed the Second Amendment. This is not about individuals having the right to have guns. That, to me, is it's a plausible interpretation. I'm not saying that's crazy, but it is a deviation from the framers' intent. And the worst part of it all is the irony that Justice Scalia, who I find to be just an odious, corpulent, self-important, blowhard fraud, who's always talking about originalism and judicial restraint, stare decisis, all of that. He's the guy who interpreted the Second Amendment in this new fashion to expand gun rights for individuals. And what he did in that case, to me, is exactly what the court did in Roe v. Wade, which is, it's kind of like judicial legislation where you kind of cut the baby in half. Because in the days of the militia, people were entitled to have access to the most advanced weapons available to fight against enemies that may invade. So he can't plausibly say that we all have the right to Stinger missiles and nuclear warheads. So he kind of cut the baby in half and said some arms can be regulated and some arms cannot.
Right. But Steve, I think the history is actually a lot more complicated than that. When the framers talked about what the militia was, the statements of the framers was that the militia was we the people. The founding fathers didn't believe in a standing army. They thought a standing army was going to be used by the government for tyrannical purposes. They believed in we the people having guns, that when called out to serve, we would come out with our guns in hand and be ready to fight in an instant. Hence the Minutemen from Revolutionary era fame. And as early as the 1810s and 1820s, you can find state court after state court after state court reading the Second Amendment to protect an individual's right to have a gun. In fact, it would be odd to think that the Second Amendment does not protect an individual right. Every other provision in the Bill of Rights refers to an individual right, and yet this one would be a right of states, not a right of individuals. It would be a bizarre ruling. And besides which, for all the controversy over the Second Amendment, any close look at history, even a superficial look at history of the 14th Amendment, would show that when the 14th Amendment was adopted, right after the Civil War, to protect the rights of the freedmen, the framers of the 14th Amendment said repeatedly that this amendment is designed to protect the right of the freedmen to have guns for personal protection against those marauding white racists like the KKK. Whatever the Second Amendment says, that's pretty ambiguous for a variety of reasons, historically and whatnot. There is no doubt that the 14th Amendment was added to our Constitution in part to protect the right of people to have access to firearms for personal protection.
Well, I think what we need to look at, the reality of our current situation, is that nobody's saying that it's absolute, that there is room for regulation, as you said. So, we can have this discussion all day in this debate, and it is interesting. I mean, didn't Justice Stevens say that if they had meant that it was for personal use, they would have explicitly stated that when they wrote it?
That's exactly what Stevens said.
Yeah.
Right? But again, the hard part is like, so it says the right of the people to keep and bear arms. So if we're going to say that doesn't mean individual people, so when it says the right of the people to petition government for redress of grievances in the First Amendment, does that not mean individuals? Or when it says the right of people to be secure in their persons and effects in the Fourth Amendment, does that mean that's not the right of individuals? It's hard to imagine that the framers put the exact same word in amendments that were added at the exact same time to mean two totally different things. I don't think that makes sense as a matter of legal interpretation.
Those are very fair points, and even if I concede that yes, the Second Amendment allows individuals to own guns, it doesn't say guns. It says arms. And what does arms mean? I mean, it can mean anything from an automatic weapon where you just hold the trigger down and it sprays as many bullets as possible, to a knife. These are all arms. So I mean, no one can reasonably argue that any person can have any arms. Like, I mean, can I walk around with grenades? Can I have sarin gas I can spray on people? I mean, I'm a bad marksman. I'm bad at shooting a gun. I prefer grenades, let's say. Would that be okay? Well, there's no grenade lobby. They don't make money on grenades, so there's no argument, for that. But there is a gun lobby. They make a lot of money selling these guns, and the more advanced these guns become, and the more deadly they become, the more expensive they become. They make more money. And I think we should really talk about the crazy transition of the NRA from what they were originally founded for to their perversion in the 70s to becoming basically a lobbying arm of the gun manufacturers. Because their original motto on their building in 1957 was firearms safety education, marksmanship training, and shooting for recreation. That was their original motto. And now the motto has been changed to, we can all have guns.
All guns all the time.
So was the NRA just co-opted by
Yes.
gun manufacturers, and then that's when they kind of changed their tune to let's make sure everyone has a gun?
Well, in the 1970s, wasn't there just a huge shift in their tone and their mission, right? So
Well, the NRA
was crafting gun control or helping to.
That's right. That's right. I
craft it.
mean, it's surprising, but the NRA was not always the no compromises opponent of gun control we know today. In the 1920s and 1930s, the NRA was a proponent of gun control, drafting and then endorsing in state after state restrictive laws barring people from carrying weapons out on the street without a license and limiting who could get that license. In fact, when Congress was considering the first federal gun control law, the National Firearms Act of 1934, the head of the NRA was asked to testify about whether the Second Amendment imposed any limitations on what Congress can do. He said, "I've not given it any study from that point of view."
Wow.
Pretty surprising perspective. It's not until the 1970s that the NRA undergoes a radical transformation when the hardliners take over literally overnight, stage a coup of the membership,
Right.
at the membership meeting and devote it to this no compromises view of the Second Amendment.
So, what I'm getting from this discussion, and my real conclusion is, it doesn't even really matter what the Constitution says at the end of the day when you have this problem of money in politics, money influencing certain policies that are being made here in the United States. I mean, we could sit here and interpret what the Second Amendment means. What were they referring to when they were talking about arms or when they were writing about arms? And in this case, it doesn't really matter because the people that get to make the decisions are the gun manufacturers and their ability to make unlimited campaign contributions. That's what really influences members of Congress and policy.
Well, I mean, there's room for hope because as Adam said, I mean, this happened almost overnight with the NRA. I mean, let me just read you what Franklin Orth, he's the NRA's executive vice president, said back in '63 after Lee Harvey Oswald assassinated JFK. He got the gun through mail order. So they proposed legislation to stop mail order guns. And this NRA vice president said, "We do not think that any sane American who calls himself an American can object to placing this bill, the instrument which killed the President of the United States." So they're very much in favor of gun control and sane gun laws. And that just kind of disappeared overnight with the hardliners. So I think we can maybe reverse that maybe not overnight, but at least we can try to do that.
But I think an important distinction is NRA leadership and NRA membership, because we're seeing over 70% of NRA members don't want guns falling into the hands of the mentally ill or criminals, and are supportive of some sort of common sense gun legislation. So they're not the same. They're very distinct, and if the NRA leadership is just speaking for the manufacturers, then that's not representative of their membership.
All right, Laurie, I'll let you have the last word on that segment. We got to take one more break, and when we come back, we'll talk about the media's coverage of this tragic shooting. Have they been covering the story correctly? And if so, what kind of impact have they had on our population? We'll be back. Welcome back to The Point, and our final point is about the media's coverage of the shooting and whether or not they've done a good job in doing the coverage. So, Steve-O, first question goes to you. Do you see the media spinning this for ratings?
Yes.
You do? Okay, so let's discuss that a little bit.
It's very easy to blame the media, and I don't like doing that. But
well, we're part of the media.
But when I was watching CNN's coverage, I was a little bit horrified. Look, reporting on the event, of course you have to report on the event, and reporting on the victims, I think that's fine. But when they do these like reenactments with these drawings, and then he turned this way, and he shot beautiful little Kayla Johnson in the face right here, and then he turned, I call it violence porn. Because that's what it is. I mean, it appeals to your emotions, your visceral reactions, and it just gets the viewer sucked in. Oh my God, I can't believe that happened. And I don't know what that really does in terms of helping anyone in any way. It's really to drive ratings. And at a certain level, I know you have to cover the event, and I don't know exactly what the perfectly responsible way to cover it is versus the irresponsible way, but there is definitely a line that they do cross, and I've seen it cross many times. And the other thing that I think it does is that, if you're a crazy person sitting at home and you're thinking, wow, this Adam Lanza guy killed a lot of people. Oh wait, he's number 2. This other guy, Cho, he killed more people at Virginia Tech. He's number 1. Maybe I'll be number 1. Mm-hmm. And by creating this ranking of the worst school shooting, the second worst school shooting, the third worst school shooting, again, I understand the media's need to report some of that too, but I think there is some impact by hyping it up like that has on some unstable people. I
actually disagree with you a little bit. When I was watching coverage of it, the one thing that really bothered me was the number of young children who had just been through one of the most traumatic experiences of their lives, having cameras shoved in their faces and microphones. Leave the kids alone, okay? Just give them a second to breathe. That's what I had a problem with. But in terms of coverage, I mean, as long as they're reporting the facts, the media has a responsibility and an obligation to tell the public what's going on. And it's very difficult to draw the line. So do any of you guys have suggestions as to what that line is? Is there something that you saw that, you know, really bothered you, Laurie?
I agree with you. I mean, shoving those microphones in those kids' faces, it doesn't have any news value. And they really have just lived through something that none of us can imagine. And their story we don't need to hear those details today. At some point, what we find, because we work with a lot of gun violence survivors, they're going to want to share their story because it's going to be healing and they're going to be able to help others. But these are tiny children, and we need to let them have their chance. And this town, it was interesting, I was at a news station recently and one of the reporters was saying he was so thankful he wasn't being sent to Connecticut because he had been to Littleton after Columbine, and he hated it. He hated that he was there. He knew they didn't want them there, and he knew that he was really crossing a line. So even the reporters themselves have some discomfort. I've heard that from a lot of reporters.
It's a difficult thing to cover, Adam.
I was going to say, there's no doubt that the media went too far, and especially with regards to underage children should not be approached at this time. At the same time, we demand so much from the media. We all want this information. We want perfect information, and we want it right away. And it becomes very difficult. And I think one of the problems with this sort of rush to get information that we all participate in, that's really audience-driven. It's not driven by the big media companies. It's by people who want that information and are putting the demands on those media companies to deliver it. You know, it took me 2 or 3 days before I got enough information to challenge all the bad facts that I got on day one, on Friday, when it all happened. I remember by the end of Friday, we all thought he did this with 2 handguns and that he had left the assault rifle in his car. But it turns out that he had left the handguns in his car, or he had the assault rifle with him all the time. It's just, we demand so much of the media. One thing I do like about what's happening with the media, though, is the media is keeping this story alive right now, and it is focusing on the story and on the need for gun control, and on second-guessing our current gun policies, which is exactly what we need to do right now. And so I don't think the gun control reforms that we need are going to be adopted unless the media plays an important role in keeping the story alive.
I love that you mentioned the media keeping the story alive, because that is critical, especially right now with the need for gun control in the country. And you know, with our show, there was a little bit of debate behind the scenes as to whether or not we should do a gun-related show in response to the shooting. Is it still going to be relevant? And I think that it is the job of the media to keep it relevant, even if it's a week after the shooting, a month after the shooting, until we see some real change. But you know, another thing that I wanted to bring up is the need for immediate information and perfect information. I love that you brought that up, because it happens with every major story now. When the Supreme Court made a ruling on the healthcare decision, right? There was so much confusion. We're like, wait a minute, are they siding with Obama? Are they siding with the Republicans? What's happening? And you know, of course, at first we got the wrong information. And the same thing happened here, where we thought that there were 2 shooters, as you mentioned. So should the media just hold off and not report anything until they can confirm everything? Is the public going to be upset at that? I mean, what's the right way to play it? And Steve, I want to ask you that question.
Look, I mean, Adam makes a very good point about, you know, the public demands all of this. So, I mean, that's the reason why I don't like to blame the media a lot of times, because they're just kind of reporting what the people want to hear. People wanted to hear Casey Anthony stories over and over, which is relatively unimportant in the national and international scope of things, and they would rather not hear about LIBOR scandals and what's happening with the Treasury. That bores them. They want the intimate details, the gory details of a personal tragedy. So we'd report that, but I do think that at some point the media has to be bigger than that. They have to decide, you know what, the people may want this, but we're going to report that instead, and we're going to report it in a responsible way. So, I mean, you know, your question about right away versus, you know, let's wait and then report later. I always think we should wait until we get facts. But I think the media, they live in their own bubble and they take such great pride. Oh my God, CNN beat Fox in reporting this event by 18 seconds. Like, who cares? But they do care. And they feel like they got scooped if the other side does it first. And to me, it's ridiculous. Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'm one of those people who wants some facts right away. Whenever I hear anything, what type of gun was used and how was it obtained? I am one of those people that's asking that right away, because that's really relevant information. So
yeah.
And in this age of Twitter and Instagram and people are going to seek out the information, and they're going to get bad information if the media is not playing its role in ferreting out the bad information from the good information. So all we can really hope is not to eliminate the media's desire for quick answers. All we can hope for is that the media will do a better job of filtering out the wrong information and only reporting the best information rather than hiding behind, well, the reports indicate that X happened, rather than confirming the sources. There's nothing wrong with waiting 18 seconds before you get confirmation and tell the right story.
When it comes to the print version of CNN, I feel like they kind of played it right, because the first report that they released was not detailed at all. All they said was, we have reports that a shooting took place at this school, and we will fill you in as soon as we know more details. And I think that's the right way to handle it. Continue updating the audience as soon as you're able to have concrete evidence and you are able to confirm the information that you're sharing, because the misinformation spreads rapidly and it's very difficult to make the corrections and make sure that everyone has the right information later on.
I don't really have a big problem with the media trying to report something right away and getting it wrong, so long as it's not something that's dangerous. For example, if they reported that there was another shooter on the loose, they shouldn't do that, because then that might cause panic and worse. But if they just report the things that are wrong, it's not a big deal. But what I want to talk about here for this segment is, the responsibility the media has in reporting, these mass shootings and gun violence in general. And I think there is some level of ridiculous reporting. I don't want to pick on Fox, but on Fox, right away they had people saying, we should arm teachers, and I think that's irresponsible reporting. Is that
Fox is the epitome of irresponsible reporting.
Right.
That's pretty unsurprising.
But right away, that's the first thing that they say when emotions are high, and they didn't put any thought behind that. Really, you want to send your kids into a place where there's a gun in every single classroom? There are 3 million teachers. Are we sure that all 3 million are sane? I don't think. I wouldn't.
That's their talking point, and they wanted to get that out there right away before some common sense entered the dialogue. I read a letter to the editor, which is separate from the media, that said it's the proliferation of these gun-free zones that are a problem, like schools and movie theaters. That's our big problem, is we have signs that say, no guns here. So, Fox had to get out there quickly to speak to those people.
Should the media give a platform to these people like Louis Gohmert, who say things like that? He goes, I just wish that poor principal had an AR-15 in her hand.
What about Mike Huckabee saying, well, it's because we took religion out of schools and that's why things like this happen? It's the most irresponsible talking point you could possibly have after this kind of tragedy. First of all, separation of church and state. Of course, Huckabee doesn't care about that. But you're blaming the victims in this case.
That's a perfect example. Okay, so all right, fine. Let's say Huckabee said that. I don't know who he said it with. I don't know who was next to him.
He was on Fox News.
But someone should have said, "Is that right? Really? How about Oikos University, a Christian university where we just had a mass shooting? This is in Oakland." 2 months ago, 4 months ago, I forget. These happen so often, I can't keep track. But he's clearly wrong, and it's just an asinine thing to say in the first place. They got to call him out on that. And that's what drives me crazy with the media. They treat everything, well, that's your opinion, that's your opinion. I don't care how crazy it is, you're entitled to it. I'm not going to challenge you whatsoever. And you just move on to the next point. That drives me crazy.
Well, also, gun advocates in the media are looking for a scapegoat. Now, I'm not saying that, the lack of mental health facilities is a scapegoat. That's a real problem that we should address in this country. But another thing that's been brought up by Jamie Foxx is the fact that, our video games and our movies are violent, and we need to, get control of that before we have any other discussion. Is that a legitimate point to make in the media? Is that something that is actually influencing people to be violent, or in your thoughts?
Studies show both sides of this thing, and I think the jury's out on that. But that shouldn't stop us from moving forward on the common sense legislation that we're talking about. These are not mutually exclusive issues. I've always believed there should be more mental health funding. It's not one or the other. So we should be looking at everything. I just read a Washington Post study that compiled information from 10 different studies, and it said that video games weren't a problem. I don't know what the answer is to that, but let's look at it, and meanwhile, let's move forward where we know we can make a difference.
That's a great point.
Totally right. Of course. Even if movies are a problem, the guns are also a problem. You know, when I watch Star Wars, I love the lightsaber. I want to kill people with a lightsaber. But you know why I didn't do it? I don't have a lightsaber. But if I watch a movie that inspires me to kill with a gun, I could get a gun really easily. So here, clearly guns are the problem. Even if the movies are a contributing factor, you have to look at the guns, you have to look at the people who had the guns, and come up with some kind of sane way to regulate all of that.
All right. Well, we are unfortunately out of time, so we have to wrap up the show. But I want to thank all three of you for coming on and having a great discussion about this. I think that it was a very common sense yet detailed discussion on something that we aren't seeing too often in the media right now. And you know, I want to thank our panelists, Laurie Saffian. Laurie, please tell our audience where they can find you and the awesome work that you do.
Well, please check out our website, wagv.org, and like us on Facebook and follow us for updates, because January is going to be a major month of action, culminating in a big demonstration in D.C. at the end of the month, coinciding with the State of the Union.
All right, thank you so much for joining us. And Adam Winkler, you are a professor at UCLA. Is there anything else that you're working on that you would like to share with our audience? I know you wrote a great book.
Well, if people are interested, I look at the complicated history of guns in my book, Gunfight, The Battle Over the Right to Bear Arms in America, and you can follow me on Twitter. I think my Twitter handle is there on the screen. Excellent.
And Steve-O is the executive producer of this program, and he also works on our online show, which you guys can watch Monday through Friday. You want to give them the time zone?
I just want to say thank you to our panelists. I went to UCLA Law School. It's ranked 15th in the country right now, and to be a professor there, you have to be friggin' smart and accomplished, and we're very pleased to have you. Thank you for coming. And Laurie, I love the work that you guys are doing. I wish you much success.
Thank you.
And I'm a little bit passionate about this issue. Thank you for showing both sides of it. So
it was
appreciate
a great discussion. All right, well, that does it for this week's episode of The Point. We will see you next week with another great episode. In fact, we're doing a producer's version, okay? So you guys will get to hear some of the fun behind-the-scenes drama that happens when it comes to making this show. And you guys can check me out at The Young Turks Monday through Friday at youtube.com/TYT Live, 6 to 8 p.m. Pacific time. See you next week.